few acknowledgments before I get going, and I've already declared that I may go over the 10-minute mark, so if you see the hook coming out, just let me know. I would like to acknowledge as well being on traditional Indigenous lands, and I would like to thank Jewish Child and Family Services for hosting this event. Also like to recognize the Children in Limbo Task Force for sponsoring this symposium. I've been a member of the Children in Limbo Task Force for over 2 decades, although I can't take any credit at all for planning this particular symposium. So I want to acknowledge the efforts of my colleagues who have really spent the time putting together this symposium. And I'm particularly impressed by the fact that we have included so many young people, and we'll hear their voices not only in this session, but in the workshops this afternoon as well. I'm especially pleased to see such a large turnout and the participation of Dr. Jim Wilkes, who, as our past chair, was and has been our inspirational leader for so many years. Now, I also want to thank Erwin for his role as Provincial Child and Youth Advocate. It's a very challenging job, to be sure, and I think he has undervalued the ability and the value of storytelling, because stories can provide such a strong narrative in terms of conveying messages, and he certainly, in my travels, has brought youth amplification to a new level in this province, which has informed and shaped, in many ways, the new legislation we're discussing today. So thank you, Erwin. Now to get on with my remarks. By way of introductory context, I have worked with different child serving systems in various roles in different parts of the country. A common theme is that the professionals involved, by and large, those of you in this room, are individuals who care deeply about the well-being of children and youth and want to see them enjoy better outcomes and be provided with opportunities where they can thrive and reach their full potential. The limitations relate not to the individuals, but to the systems themselves that at times fail to put children at the center of service delivery and decision-making, and too often operate in silos. There are some groundbreaking provisions in the new Child, Youth, and Family Services Act. It's been called historic legislation, groundbreaking legislation, and it certainly has that potential. And it will hopefully bring about positive changes in the life conditions of Ontario's children and youth. However, the true litmus test will be whether we can translate these aspirational principles or paper rights into lived rights for children and youth in terms of their daily life experiences. So, what are the needed steps towards fulfilling the goal of keeping children at the center and honoring their right to truth and voice? So I've been asked to draw upon my experience having assumed different roles and talk about some of the things that could be done perhaps a little differently to improve things further in this province. So I'm going to suggest 3 steps. My first suggestion is to move away from paternalistic and needs-based systems that have traditionally dictated the range and quality of services provided to children and youth. This requires a paradigm shift where we see and treat children as rights holders who have fundamental entitlements that create corresponding obligations on the part of government. It's not a question of benevolence. It's a question of meeting our obligations to serve the interests and protect the rights of children and young people. It also means treating every child with dignity and respect. Although we often hear the word dignity used in a general sense, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child has provided guidance by stating, quote, "The concept of dignity requires that every child is recognized, respected, and protected as rights holders and as a unique and valuable human being with an individual personality, distinct needs, interests, and privacy." The best example for me in establishing a child rights-based framework at the provincial level is the government of Saskatchewan, adopting a set of 8 Children and Youth First principles in 2009 as a kind of Bill of Rights for Saskatchewan's children and youth. These child-centered principles, which were based upon provisions in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, were first developed by my former office in 2007 as a set of guiding principles for the office to protect the rights and well-being of all children and youth in receipt of government services in Saskatchewan as reflected in law, policy, programming, and practice. In the case of Ontario, it would be timely to enact a private member's bill. Bill 57, the Caitlin's Principle Act, Decisions Affecting Children, which would incorporate the full scope of Caitlin's Principle. This bill would require any person making a decision affecting children under Ontario legislation to apply Caitlin's Principle. This broad application of Caitlin's Principle would be consistent with the first recommendation of a Caitlin Sampson inquest jury verdict, which reads as follows. So I'm quoting, this is from the jury recommendation, that all parties to this inquest ensure that Caitlin's Principle applies to all services, policies, legislation, and decision-making that affects children. And as Irwin said, we have major elements or components of Caitlin's Principle in our new legislation, but we don't have all of it. The first 2 elements of Caitlin's Principle, as set out in Bill 57, reinforce the theme of this symposium, that the child must be at the center of the decision. And secondly, that the child is an individual with rights. The child must always be seen, the child's voice must be heard, and the child must be listened to and respected. The enactment of Bill 57 would represent a welcome piece of companion legislation to the Child, Youth, and Family Services Act, since our new legislation that we're discussing today does not explicitly name Caitlin's Principle or set out Caitlin's Principle in its entirety, and limits its application to service providers rather than applying it as originally contemplated to legislators, policymakers, and decision makers such as the courts and tribunals. So I know that you, as service providers, are going to be operating within the regime of Caitlin's Principle and the obligations imposed by this legislation. But is it going to be integrated into the decision-making of others, by the judiciary, by hearing officers? I think that's a good question. Additionally, Caitlin's Principle is not referenced in the Child, Youth, and Family Services Act as applying across all provincial ministry divisions, although that was what was contemplated in Caitlin's Principle. It's not just child welfare, it's not just services that are provided under the ambit of the Ministry of Children and Youth Services that should be guided by that principle. This should cut across all provincial government ministries. We know that children who are engaged in the child welfare system cross over into other ministries, health, education, and justice. And they deserve to be at the center of those systems as well. So the enactment of Bill 57 would establish a whole of province legislative framework that respects the rights of children and youth and their voice and participation. It could ultimately be incorporated as one part of a provincial Bill of Rights for Ontario's children and youth, based upon extensive consultation with children, youth, and other stakeholders to determine what should be incorporated into that provincial Bill of Rights. So there's enough space for a Catlin Principles Act in addition to the Child, Youth, and Family Services Act. And this shouldn't be a politically partisan issue. We have an excellent piece of legislation that the provincial government has enacted, and it will be proclaimed shortly, but there is space for the good work of other political parties to improve the system in this province. The second suggestion is to more meticulously consider the impacts upon different groups of children and youth, using a child rights sensitive lens before introducing new or amended legislation, policies, and programming that will affect them. So impact assessments are not new and have been used in a variety of policy domains in Canada, such as environmental protection, health, gender, equity, and privacy. Here, a positive example is the progressive steps taken by the governments of New Brunswick and Saskatchewan regarding their innovative use and implementation of child rights impact assessments. Specifically, a child rights impact assessment, if you're wondering what that is a tool for assessing the potential impacts of a proposed or existing policy, law, program, or decision on children and their rights. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is the framework used to assess these impacts. The impacts identified can be many. They can be positive or negative, intended or unintended, direct or indirect, and short-term or long-term. The focus of a child rights impact assessment is to evaluate how matters under consideration will promote or undermine the fulfillment of children's interdependent convention rights and overall well-being. In New Brunswick, there is now an all-of-province commitment to using child rights impact assessments. Since February of 2013, so we're coming on to close to 5 years. It has been mandatory for all New Brunswick government departments to complete a child rights impact assessment and attach it to a memorandum to Executive Council whenever a proposed law or policy is being forwarded to Cabinet for its consideration and approval. In Saskatchewan, the Ministry of Social Services has used child rights impact assessments as a framework for reforming child welfare and adoption legislation, and for ongoing policy and programming development. Each of these provinces, to their credit, has gone the extra mile and developed its own simplified and user-friendly assessment tools. There is an opportunity here for the province of Ontario to develop and apply a child rights impact assessment process, which hasn't been done to date. Not only during the next 5-year review of this legislation, the children in this province shouldn't have to wait that long, but also in the short term, as new regulations, directives, and policies and procedures are considered and rolled out as necessary implementation measures. Without such a child rights-based impact analysis, we run the risk of setting off potential unintended negative consequences for children, notwithstanding the government's best intentions. An Ontario child rights impact assessment model, with its own tools and templates, could build upon the experiences and lessons learned both internationally and in other Canadian jurisdictions. The implementation of such a framework would then put Ontario children front and center in all government decision-making and be consistent with one of the recommendations made by the coroner's jury in the Caitlin Sampson inquest, which states, and I'll quote another recommendation, The Government of Ontario, Ministry of Children and Youth Services, Ministry of Education, Ministry of the Attorney General, Family Rules Committee, Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies, Association of Native Child and Family Service Agencies of Ontario, and Children's Aid Societies of Ontario, you couldn't cast a broader net, implement a child rights impact assessment process for future reviews of legislation, regulations, directives, policies, and procedures to screen for the impact upon children's rights. So I'll now get into my final suggestion on my short list, which is to modernize and eliminate any stigmatizing and dehumanizing language in relation to children and youth. Not only in legislative language, but also in daily practice. As we all know, words are important and reflect the culture of organizations, institutions, professions, and governments. A positive example here, to give some kudos to our provincial government here in Ontario, the Ontario Ministry of Children and Youth Services changing its legislative language in its new Child, Youth and Family Services Act in response, at least in part, to much strong and persistent advocacy from my colleagues at the Children in Limbo Task Force, together with current and former youth in care, with the assistance of the Office of the Provincial Advocate for Children and Youth. When asked for their impressions of the Act, young people were particularly upset about the term runaway, because it automatically labels them delinquent, when they may in fact be running away from a dangerous situation involving physical or sexual abuse. This term was ultimately removed from the legislation. As well, the Children in Limbo Task Force successfully, even though this was not in the original draft of the bill, successfully argued that the word apprehension should be removed from the legislation. The language of apprehension has been a controversial and stigmatizing term for decades in our child welfare legislation vernacular, implying that the taking of youth into care could be equated to the apprehension of suspected criminals, at least in language. This pejorative term has now been replaced with the more appropriate language of bringing children to a place of safety. In Ontario, it would be important to go beyond child welfare legislative language and examine all provincial legislation to determine whether there is unintentional, demeaning language used to describe children and youth in various contexts. The model that was used by the Children in Limbo Task Force, in consultation with young people, would be a useful template for the provincial government. In that scenario, youth would be asked to review a piece of legislation and identify words and phrases that they consider objectionable, indicate the reasons, and suggest appropriate substituted language. Often the language that we think is benign is not received the same way by young people. Professional education could then follow with training sessions given to make sure that everyone is aware of the new respectful nomenclature. Now, there have been great strides taken in child welfare, but we can't continue to take a myopic sectoral approach. We have to broaden this out so that children can receive innovative thinking. Their voices are going to be amplified across all government ministries throughout Ontario. So in conclusion, yes, I'm concluding. There are many ways in which we can better strive to put children at the center and honor their right to truth and voice. We can all become child advocates in our own right. I used to say this in Saskatchewan, and I know that Irwin says this here in Ontario. It's bigger than one office. And we can all find opportunities to make a positive difference in the lives of children and youth. This is a collective responsibility that doesn't just rest with legislators and government officials or even statutory child and youth advocates. So I said that not all elements of Caitlin's principle are incorporated into the Child, Youth and Family Services Act. So I'm going to close with the last component of Caitlin's principle, which really reinforces the last comment I just made. So the last component of Caitlin's principle says, everyone who provides services to children or services that affect children are child advocates. Advocacy may potentially be a child's lifeline. It must occur from the point of first contact and on a continuous basis thereafter. So it's not a single event. It's a continuous process, an attitude, and we can all find ways to incorporate that into the work that we're doing on behalf of children and young people. So thank you very much.